heard stories. Bounty hunter. And a child.
I only hunt Imperial war criminals. I'll take out every bad guy in your deck of cards.
This isn't about revenge.
Check your armor first.
We're protecting everything the rebellion fought for.
Good luck. You're gonna need...
It's a horrible baby. It's a bad baby.
Strap in.
We need a professional.
Hang on.
When you're not there to protect him.
You good? You. Go. Go!
Mandalorian. You Eastern.
Monsters. The old protect the young. And then the young protect the old. It's time.
B.
Good job, baby.
In a galaxy filled with legendary heroes, giant space battles, and stories about destiny, one tiny green child and one silent warrior somehow became the emotional heart of modern Star Wars. The Mandalorian and Grogu arrives with the pressure of carrying one of the biggest entertainment franchises in history while also trying to protect the magic that made audiences fall in love with these characters in the first place. This is not just another Star Wars movie, it feels like a bridge between generations. Older fans see echoes of the original trilogy, younger fans see adventure and wonder, and casual viewers simply see a touching story about family hidden beneath helmets, blasters, and hyperspace jumps. The movie already carried huge expectations before cameras even started rolling. The Disney Plus series The Mandalorian changed the future of Star Wars television. At a time when fans were divided about the direction of the franchise, the series brought back the feeling of dusty planets, dangerous bounty hunters, practical action, and emotional simplicity. Din Djarin was mysterious but relatable. Grogu became an instant cultural phenomenon. Their connection worked because it was universal. One was a lonely warrior trying to survive. The other was an innocent child needing protection. Together, they created one of the strongest emotional partnerships in science fiction. Turning that relationship into a theatrical film was both exciting and risky. Television storytelling allows slower character movements, side quests, and world building over many hours. A movie must feel larger, faster, and more cinematic while still keeping the intimacy fans love. That challenge became one of the biggest talking points during the movie's development. Many wondered whether the transition from streaming to theaters could truly work. Some believed Star Wars belonged on the big screen no matter what. Others worried the movie might feel like an extended TV episode. Those conversations followed the project from its first announcement all the way through production. The development of the film represented a major turning point for Lucasfilm. After years of changing release schedules, cancelled projects, and uncertainty surrounding theatrical Star Wars movies, the company needed a clear direction. Instead of launching an entirely new trilogy immediately, Lucasfilm chose familiarity and emotional connection. Din Djarin and Grogu were already globally recognized. Merchandise sales were enormous. The characters had meme power, emotional power, and audience trust. From a business perspective, choosing them for the next theatrical chapter made perfect sense. The creative team also understood something important. Star Wars has always worked best when the emotional core is simple. Beneath all the politics and mythology, the original films were about friendship, hope, redemption, and family. The Mandalorian series succeeded because it returned to that foundation. The movie aimed to continue that spirit while increasing the scale. Fans expected larger action scenes, deeper mythology, and emotional consequences that felt worthy of a theatrical release. Much of the early excitement centered around the return of Pedro Pascal as Din Djarin. Pascal's performance had become iconic despite the fact that audiences rarely saw his face. His voice carried exhaustion, warmth, pain, and humor with subtle precision. The role proved how powerful physical acting and vocal performance could be even without traditional facial expressions. Pascal had already become one of Hollywood's most beloved actors thanks to projects like The Last of Us, but Din Djarin remained one of his defining roles. Then there was Grogu, arguably the most successful new Star Wars character introduced in decades. The character exploded into internet culture almost instantly after appearing in the first season of the show. Memes flooded social media, toy demand became massive, fans connected with Grogu because he represented innocence in a violent galaxy. His small gestures, curious expressions, and relationship with Din gave the franchise emotional warmth that many viewers felt had been missing for years. The movie also became an interesting experiment in balancing nostalgia with originality. Star Wars often walks a dangerous line between honoring the past and creating something new. Too much nostalgia can feel repetitive. Too much change divide audiences. The Mandalorian and Grogu appeared designed to sit directly in the middle. It used familiar Star Wars imagery while focusing on newer characters and post return of the Jedi storytelling. As development continued, discussions about the film's tone became increasingly important. Would it feel darker like Rogue One? Would it lean into adventure and humor like the original trilogy? Would it connect directly to the larger Mandoverse involving other Disney Plus shows? Early reports suggested the filmmakers wanted a cinematic Western adventure with emotional stakes at the center. That approach made sense considering the roots of The Mandalorian. The show always carried the DNA of samurai films and old westerns. Lone warriors traveling dangerous lands, protecting the innocent, and struggling with personal codes of honor have always been part of those storytelling traditions. The casting process became another major source of fan speculation. While Pascal's return was guaranteed, audiences wondered which familiar faces from the series might appear alongside him. Characters like Grief Karga, Bo-Katan Kryze, and Ahsoka Tano had become deeply connected to the larger story world. Fans debated online constantly about possible appearances, secret cameos, and crossover connections. Some hoped for legendary legacy characters. Others wanted the film to remain focused mainly on Din and Grogu without becoming overcrowded. Lucasfilm carefully managed information during production, understanding how intense Star Wars fandom can become. Every leaked set photo, rumor, or casting report quickly spread across social media. Entire YouTube channels dedicated hours of analysis to tiny details. This level of obsession is unique to franchises like Star Wars. Every costume detail, spaceship design, or dialogue leak becomes part of a massive online discussion. The production itself reportedly aimed for a practical visual style similar to the television series. One reason audiences connected strongly with The Mandalorian was its tactile feeling. The costumes looked real, the ships looked weathered, the planets felt lived in. Many fans believed this grounded visual style brought back the spirit of the original trilogy more successfully than some recent Star Wars projects. The filmmakers understood that maintaining this aesthetic would be crucial for the movie's success. Technology also remained a major part of the production process. The series famously used stagecraft virtual production technology, allowing environments to be projected on massive LED screens rather than relying entirely on green screens. This technique gave actors more immersive surroundings while allowing filmmakers incredible flexibility. The movie expanded upon those techniques while still trying to preserve practical realism. Filming reportedly involved large scale action sequences, creature effects, and detailed set construction. Star Wars has always depended heavily on visual imagination. Alien cantinas, dangerous planets, and starship interiors are not just backgrounds, they are part of the identity of the franchise itself. Fans expect every corner of the galaxy to feel alive. That means costume designers, creature artists, and production designers carry enormous responsibility. Costume work on the film likely demanded incredible precision, especially for Mandalorian armor. Over the years, Mandalorian culture has become one of the richest parts of Star Wars lore. Different armor colors, symbols, and designs often carry cultural meaning. Fans analyze these details obsessively. Even small design changes can spark endless online theories. The action choreography became another anticipated highlight. The series already featured impressive combat involving jetpacks, blasters, knives, and hand to hand fights. A theatrical budget allowed the filmmakers to increase the scale significantly. Fans expected faster space battles, more ambitious fight scenes, and cinematic set pieces worthy of IMAX screens. One fascinating aspect of the movie's anticipation involved the emotional evolution of Din and Grogu's relationship. In many ways, the pair already completed major arcs in the series. Din learned to care deeply for someone else. Grogu slowly balanced his connection to the Force with his attachment to his surrogate father. The movie therefore needed to push their relationship into new territory. Audiences wanted emotional growth, not repetition. The music represented another enormous responsibility. Star Wars music is legendary because of John Williams, whose themes became part of global pop culture. But the Mandalorian series created its own musical identity thanks to composer Ludwig Göransson. His work blended Western sounds, tribal percussion, electronic textures, and heroic melodies into something fresh while still feeling unmistakably Star Wars. The famous Mandalorian theme became instantly recognizable. Few modern franchise themes achieve that level of cultural impact so quickly. The haunting recorder melody felt lonely, heroic, and mysterious all at once. Expanding that musical language into a theatrical score required balancing intimacy with cinematic grandeur. Fans hoped the movie's soundtrack would become one of the defining musical experiences of modern Star Wars. Another major topic surrounding the movie involved the future direction of Star Wars itself. For years, Fans debated whether the franchise should focus on nostalgia driven stories or move completely beyond legacy eras. The Mandalorian and Grogu sat directly in the middle of that argument. It used familiar aesthetics and timeline connections while also building new emotional foundations. Its success or failure would likely influence Lucasfilm's strategy for years. Online meme culture played a huge role in keeping excitement alive. Grogu memes remained everywhere long after the character's debut. Social media users constantly created jokes about his appetite, tiny size, force abilities, and relationship with Din. Some memes portrayed him as adorable. Others imagined him as secretly powerful and dangerous. This meme culture helped transform Grogu into more than just a TV character. He became an internet icon. Din Djarin himself also inspired memes, especially involving his strict Mandalorian beliefs and awkward parenting moments. Fans loved the contrast between his deadly combat skills and his confusion about caring for a child. That humor became one of the series' strengths. The movie appeared aware of this balance between seriousness and comedy. The release strategy became another important discussion point. Star Wars theatrical releases are cultural events unlike almost anything else in entertainment. Midnight screenings, fan costumes, massive marketing campaigns, and endless speculation all become part of the experience. Lucasfilm clearly hoped the movie would reignite that level of excitement after years without a theatrical Star Wars film. Marketing likely focused heavily on emotional imagery rather than simply action spectacle. Din and Grogu walking together, flying through space, or facing danger side by side represent the emotional center audiences care about most. Posters, trailers, and promotional material probably emphasized their bond as much as explosions or battles. The box office expectations for the film were enormous. Star Wars remains one of the biggest entertainment brands in history, but recent theatrical inconsistency created uncertainty. Some analysts predicted huge numbers because of Grogu's popularity. Others warned that audience trust in blockbuster franchises has become less predictable in recent years. Regardless, the movie carried major financial importance for Disney and Lucasfilm. Critically, the movie entered a complicated landscape. Modern franchise films face intense scrutiny from both for professional critics and online fandoms. Star Wars discussions often become emotionally charged. Different generations of fans want different things from the franchise. Some prioritize mythology and lore, others care more about emotional storytelling and adventure. Satisfying everyone is nearly impossible. One interesting element of the film's reception involved casual audiences versus hardcore fans. Hardcore fans analyze continuity details obsessively, while casual viewers mainly want strong entertainment and emotional connection. The filmmakers needed to satisfy both groups simultaneously. Too much lore could alienate newcomers. Too little depth could disappoint longtime fans. Thematically, the movie appeared likely to continue exploring ideas of identity and belonging. Din Djarin's story has always involved questions about culture, loyalty, and personal growth. Grogu's story involves balancing destiny with emotional attachment. These themes resonate because they reflect real human experiences hidden beneath science fiction fantasy. The father child dynamic remained the emotional anchor. Many viewers connected deeply with the idea of an emotionally closed off warrior slowly learning vulnerability through caring for a child. That emotional simplicity transcends franchise storytelling. Even people unfamiliar with wider Star Wars lore could understand that relationship immediately. Visually, the movie promised to deliver classic Star Wars iconography with updated cinematic scale. Desert worlds, alien creatures, hyperspace travel, glowing cockpit lights, and mysterious ancient locations all remain central to the franchise's identity. Fans expected the movie to honor those visual traditions while introducing new environments and creatures. The film also represented an important test for streaming born franchises transitioning to theaters. Hollywood increasingly blurs the line between television and cinema. The Mandalorian and Grogu became a major example of how studios hope to turn successful streaming characters into theatrical draws. If successful, other franchises may follow similar paths. Fan theories exploded throughout development. Some believed Grogu's future might eventually connect directly to the sequel trilogy timeline. Others hoped the movie would avoid those connections entirely. Discussions about Mandalorian politics, surviving Imperial forces, and Force mythology dominated online communities for months. One particularly fascinating aspect of the fandom surrounding the film is how different generations experience Star Wars differently. Older viewers who grew up with the original trilogy often see Din as spiritually connected to characters like Han Solo or the lone gunslingers that inspired Star Wars initially. Younger viewers, meanwhile, may see Grogu as their entry point into the franchise. This generational crossover gives the movie unusual cultural power. The production design likely embraced the used universe philosophy that made Star Wars visually revolutionary in 1977. Ships are dirty, armor is scratched, buildings feel ancient and repaired countless times. This realism helps fantasy worlds feel believable. The Mandalorian series excelled at this visual texture, and fans expected the movie to continue that tradition on a larger scale. Creature effects remained another anticipated highlight. Star Wars has always relied heavily on aliens and strange creatures to create immersion. Practical puppetry combined with modern CGI allowed the filmmakers to make worlds feel crowded and alive. Grogu himself works largely because of expert puppetry and physical performance rather than purely digital animation. Another interesting conversation involved the film's pacing. Television storytelling allows detours and slower emotional beats. A movie requires tighter structure. Fans wondered whether the filmmakers would preserve the wandering adventure feeling of the series or shift toward a more direct narrative. Balancing episodic charm with cinematic momentum became one of the project's biggest creative challenges. The movie also carried symbolic importance for Lucasfilm leadership. After years of franchise debates and shifting plans, a successful theatrical return centered around beloved characters could stabilize audience confidence. It represented a chance to remind viewers why they fell in love with Star Wars originally. Social media reactions to every teaser image demonstrated the intense emotional investment fans still have in the franchise. A single shot of Grogu using the Force or Din standing in a dramatic environment could dominate internet discussion for days. Few franchises maintain that level of cultural attention across generations. The movie's humor likely remained understated but important. One reason the Mandalorian series succeeded was its ability to include comedy naturally without undermining emotional stakes. Grogu's behavior often provided humor through silence and visual reactions rather than constant jokes. Maintaining that balance in a feature film would be essential. As release approached, debates about spoilers became unavoidable. Star Wars fans are famously protective of surprises. Secret cameos, major character deaths, or shocking reveals can shape entire viewing experiences. Lucasfilm likely enforced extreme secrecy during production to preserve theatrical excitement. The relationship between Din and Grogu also symbolizes changing definitions of heroism in modern blockbuster storytelling. Traditional heroes are often physically dominant or chosen by destiny. Din, however, is emotionally damaged, uncertain, and constantly improvising. Grogu is tiny, vulnerable, and childlike despite immense power. Their partnership feels human despite existing in a fantasy galaxy. The movie's cinematography likely embraced wider cinematic framing compared to the television series. Massive landscapes, large scale battles, and detailed environmental shots become even more important on theater screens. Star Wars has always depended heavily on visual awe. Fans wanted moments that felt worthy of seeing in packed cinemas with giant sound systems. One cannot discuss modern Star Wars without mentioning fandom divisions. Every new project becomes part of larger debates about franchise identity, storytelling philosophy, and corporate influence. The Mandalorian and Grogu entered that environment carrying both hope and pressure. Many fans saw it as a chance to unify audiences again through emotionally grounded storytelling. Merchandising surrounding the movie was expected to become enormous. Grogu alone generates massive product demand ranging from toys to clothing to collectibles. Din's armor and weapons are also incredibly marketable. The commercial side of Star Wars has always been deeply intertwined with the storytelling itself. Another likely strength of the film involved its accessibility. Some Star Wars projects require extensive knowledge of lore and previous stories. Din and Grogu's relationship, however, is emotionally immediate. New viewers can understand the basic dynamic quickly even without deep franchise familiarity. That accessibility could help broaden the movie's audience significantly. The action style of The Mandalorian differs from many superhero films because it feels more grounded and physical. Blaster fights involve strategy and danger. Din often struggles and gets injured. That vulnerability makes victories feel earned. Fans hope the movie would preserve this tone even with increased blockbuster scale. The emotional resonance of Grogu also reflects broader audience desires in modern entertainment. In an era filled with cynical anti heroes and dark storytelling, Grogu represents innocence and hope. Audiences often respond strongly to characters who embody emotional sincerity without irony. As critics eventually shared reactions, discussions likely focused heavily on whether the movie successfully balanced spectacle and intimacy. Big franchise films sometimes lose emotional focus while chasing scale. The central question became whether Din and Grogu's relationship still felt genuine amidst larger cinematic ambitions. The future implications of the movie remain fascinating as well. If successful, it could lead to additional theatrical adventures involving these characters. It may also shape how Disney approaches interconnected storytelling between streaming and theaters moving forward. Ultimately, Star Wars. The Mandalorian and Grogu carries meaning beyond simple franchise continuation. It represents a test of modern blockbuster storytelling itself. Can giant corporate franchises still create sincere emotional connections? Can theatrical experiences remain magical in the streaming era? Can familiar universes still feel fresh? For many fans, the answer depends less on lore connections or box office numbers and more on a simple emotional truth. Do audiences still care when Din Djarin protects Grogu? Do they still smile when the tiny green child reaches out with the Force? Do they still feel wonder watching a lone ship fly across the stars while hopeful music rises in the background? If the movie captures that feeling, even briefly, then it succeeds in the way Star Wars always mattered most. Not because of technology or marketing or nostalgia, but because somewhere inside all the laser and spaceships is a story about people trying to protect each other in a dangerous galaxy. And sometimes that simple idea is powerful enough to make audiences believe in adventure again. Continue one of the most interesting things about Star Wars. The Mandalorian and Grogu is how much emotional responsibility rests on silence. Din Djarin is not a character who gives long speeches. Grogu barely speaks at all. Yet audiences understand them better than many characters who constantly explain their feelings. That emotional storytelling through body language, pauses, and small gestures became one of the defining strengths of the series, and the film had the difficult task of expanding that emotional language onto a much larger cinematic canvas. The movie reportedly leans heavily into visual storytelling, something classic Star Wars always understood well. A lonely figure walking through a desert, a child staring at stars through a cockpit window, a damaged ship drifting through darkness. These images matter because they create emotion before dialogue even begins. George Lucas originally built Star Wars on mythic simplicity and cinematic imagery. The Mandalorian and Grogu seems designed to reconnect with that visual tradition while still feeling modern. Another major talking point surrounding the film involves the evolution of Grogu himself. For years, audiences mostly viewed him as adorable comic relief mixed with mysterious force potential. But the movie arrives at a moment where the character can no longer remain only cute. Viewers now expect emotional and narrative growth. Grogu's choices carry larger consequences. His understanding of loyalty, danger, and identity must deepen if the character is going to evolve into something truly legendary within Star Wars lore. That creates an interesting challenge for the filmmakers. Grogu works because he feels innocent and childlike. But stories require progression. If the movie changes him too much, audiences may lose the charm that made him beloved. If he remains exactly the same, the character risks becoming repetitive. Finding that balance likely became one of the most delicate parts of the script writing process. The screenplay reportedly went through careful revisions to ensure the story could function both as a continuation for longtime fans and as a standalone cinematic adventure. This balance is harder than many people realize. Franchise storytelling often assumes audiences know every detail from previous shows and films, but theatrical releases need broader accessibility. Someone walking into the theater without seeing every Disney Plus episode should still understand the emotional core immediately. That likely influenced how the film introduces conflict and stakes. Din and Grogu's bond is already established, so the movie can move faster emotionally than an origin story would. At the same time, the script still needs to remind audiences why their relationship matters so deeply. That probably means the movie spends considerable time showing quiet emotional moments rather than rushing non stop into action scenes. One fascinating aspect of Din Djarin as a protagonist is how unconventional he is compared to classic blockbuster heroes. He is not the most powerful fighter in the galaxy, he is not a chosen one. He is not especially charismatic in a traditional Hollywood sense. He is often exhausted, confused, stubborn, and emotionally guarded. Yet those imperfections are exactly why audiences connect with him. The movie appears to embrace that humanity rather than turning him into an unstoppable action hero. Din succeeds because he keeps going despite fear and uncertainty. He gets hurt, he fails, he improvises. He survives through loyalty and determination more than destiny. In many ways, he feels closer to old Western protagonists than traditional science fiction superheroes. That Western influence reportedly remains strong throughout the film. Wide landscapes, tense standoffs, isolated settlements, bounty hunter culture, and themes of personal honor continue shaping the tone. Even the pacing of certain scenes reportedly mirrors classic Western cinema, allowing tension to build slowly before sudden violence erupts. At the same time, the movie expands the scale far beyond the smaller adventures of the early television seasons. Fans expected larger political implications involving Mandalorian culture, imperial remnants, and galactic instability after the fall of the Empire. One challenge for the filmmakers was preventing these larger plot lines from overshadowing the emotional relationship at the center. The post return of the Jedi timeline remains one of the most fascinating periods in Star Wars storytelling because it represents a galaxy in transition. The Empire has fallen, but peace has not truly arrived. Criminal organizations, warlords, mercenaries, and scattered Imperial loyalists still create chaos. That unstable atmosphere gives the Mandalorian its unique flavor. The galaxy feels dangerous, fragmented, and uncertain. Production designers reportedly embrace this instability visually. Imperial ships look damaged and repurposed. Cities feel economically strained. Armor appears repaired repeatedly over years of survival. These visual details help communicate that the galaxy is still recovering from massive war. Star Wars worlds always feel strongest when environments tell stories without needing exposition. The film's creature work also reportedly became one of its biggest strengths. Practical puppetry and animatronics were used heavily to maintain the tactile realism audiences associate with classic Star Wars. Modern CGI can create incredible visuals, but many fans believe Star Wars works best when creatures physically occupy space alongside actors. That realism helps audiences emotionally invest in fantastical worlds. Grogu himself reportedly continued using advanced puppetry techniques combined with subtle digital enhancements. The physical presence of the puppet allows actors to interact naturally, which strengthens emotional scenes tremendously. Many filmmakers have noted that performers respond differently to real physical objects than they do to empty green screen spaces. The movie's action sequences reportedly push Din Djarin's abilities further than ever before. His combat style has always been distinctive because it feels practical and brutal rather than flashy. He uses every tool available: blasters, flamethrowers, grappling cables, knives, and jetpacks. Unlike Jedi who move gracefully through battle, Din often survives through desperation and adaptability. Fans were especially excited about potential large scale Mandalorian combat scenes. Mandalorians have become one of the most popular warrior cultures in modern science fiction. Their armor, traditions, and combat styles create endless fascination among fans. Seeing larger numbers of Mandalorians fighting together on a theatrical scale became one of the movie's major selling points. The sound design reportedly received enormous attention during production. Star Wars sound effects are legendary for a reason. Lightsabers, blasters, droids, and ship engines are instantly recognizable worldwide. The Mandalorian series introduced its own sound identity while still respecting those traditions. The film expands that sonic landscape with deeper bass, larger environmental effects, and more immersive battle audio intended specifically for theater experiences. Another fascinating topic surrounding the movie is how it handles the Force. The original Mandalorian seasons often treated the Force with mystery and awe rather than casual familiarity. Din viewed it almost like mythology at first. Grogu's abilities felt magical and sometimes frightening. Many fans appreciated this approach because it restored mystery to concepts that sometimes became overly explained in other Star Wars projects. The movie reportedly continues that perspective. Grogu's Force abilities remain emotionally significant rather than simply functioning as superhero powers. Each use of the Force carries emotional weight and narrative meaning. That restraint reportedly helps preserve the mythic feeling that made Star Wars unique originally. There is also growing discussion about how Grogu reflects the franchise's themes of choice versus destiny. Star Wars constantly explores whether characters are trapped by fate or capable of shaping their own paths. Grogu's connection to Jedi traditions contrasts directly with his attachment to Din. That tension creates emotional depth because both paths represent important parts of his identity. The film's emotional structure reportedly mirrors parent child stories more than traditional military science fiction. Din constantly struggles between protecting Grogu and allowing him independence. That emotional conflict feels universally relatable. Parents everywhere understand the fear of letting children face danger while also knowing growth requires freedom. This emotional realism may explain why audiences connected so deeply with the series in the first place. Beneath all the fantasy elements lies a simple emotional truth about responsibility, sacrifice, and love. Din never expected to become a father figure. Grogu never expected to find a family. Their connection formed accidentally through survival and loyalty. The movie's release also carries symbolic importance for theatrical moviegoing itself. In the streaming era, studios increasingly struggle to convince audiences that films deserve big screen experiences. The Mandalorian and Grogu appear specifically designed to remind viewers why communal cinema matters. Massive sound design, sweeping visuals, and emotional crowd reactions become more powerful in theaters. There are few stories in the modern era of popular entertainment that have captured the imagination of global audiences quite so completely as the saga of Din Djarin and the creature the world came to know first as Baby Yoda and later as Grogu. What began as a simple premise, a lone warrior in a gleaming Beskar helmet traversing the fringes of a galaxy far, far away, tasked with returning a mysterious infant to his people, evolved over the course of 3 seasons of groundbreaking television into one of the most beloved partnerships in the Star Wars canon, and now in what represents a watershed moment not just for the franchise but for Hollywood's relationship with streaming born intellectual property. That partnership is making the leap to the silver screen. The Mandalorian and Grogu, also known formally as Star Wars. The Mandalorian and Grogu is scheduled for international release on May 22nd, 2026, and its arrival marks the end of a 7 year journey from the original show's Disney Plus debut to a fully fledged theatrical event. It is, by any measure, one of the most anticipated films in the history of the Star Wars franchise, and the story of how it came to be is as rich and complicated as anything in the galaxy it depicts. To understand the significance of this film, one must understand where it comes from, both in terms of narrative and production history. The seeds of what would become The Mandalorian were planted in 2017 when director and writer Jon Favreau, the man behind Iron Man and The Jungle Book, went to Lucasfilm president Kathleen Kennedy with an idea. He had been turning over in his mind a concept for a Star Wars television series that would focus on the Mandalorians, the warrior culture whose most famous representative, Boba Fett, had captured the imagination of fans since the original trilogy. Favreau's vision was for something that would feel different from what Star Wars had done before, something grittier, more intimate, with a tone closer to a classic western or samurai film than the operatic space epics that define the Skywalker saga. At roughly the same time, Dave Filoni, who had spent years as an executive producer on the acclaimed animated series Star Wars, The Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels, was independently developing similar ideas. Kennedy, recognizing the potential of both visions and the complementary strengths of the two creators, suggested they collaborate. The result of that collaboration was The Mandalorian, which debuted on November 12 2019, the very day Disney Plus launched as a streaming service. The show was an immediate sensation, but nothing could have prepared anyone. Not Favreau, not Filoni, not Lucasfilm, not Disney, for the cultural phenomenon that emerged from its very first episode. In the closing moments of that premiere, viewers were introduced to the bounty at the center of the story. Not some hardened criminal or wayward fugitive, but a tiny, enormous eyed creature, an infant of the same alien species as the legendary Jedi Master Yoda, complete with pointed ears and an expression of wide eyed wonder. The internet, as it is wont to do, had opinions, and those opinions were essentially unanimous. This was the most adorable thing it had ever seen. The creature, referred to in the show simply as the child at that stage, was immediately and affectionately dubbed Baby Yoda by the public. And what followed was one of the most extraordinary examples of organic viral enthusiasm in the history of entertainment marketing. Baby Yoda was everywhere, on memes, on merchandise, on the front pages of newspapers and entertainment publications worldwide. Saturday Night Live featured segments about the phenomenon. Celebrities fell over themselves to express their adoration. The character became almost overnight one of the most recognizable and beloved fictional creations of the 21st century. The genius of Baby Yoda of Grogu, as the character would be formally named in the second season, lies in a combination of factors that are worth examining in some detail because they inform everything about the film that follows. First, there is the design itself. Created with a meticulous combination of animatronics and puppetry, augmented by computer generated visual effects, Grogu is a masterpiece of the puppeteer's art. The character does not speak, communicates entirely through expression and gesture, and yet manages to convey an extraordinary range of emotion. He can be funny and he can be heartbreaking, often within the same scene. The technology behind his creation represents decades of accumulated knowledge about how to make audiences emotionally invest in a non human character, drawing on a lineage that runs from Kermit the Frog to E.T. to Yoda himself. Jon Favreau has spoken at length about the challenge and the deliberate choice involved in creating a character who communicates entirely without words. As producer Kathleen Kennedy would later note, Grogu is a perfect example of a character who must emote and make audiences feel genuinely connected without ever opening his mouth to speak. But Grogu is only half the equation. The other half is Din Djarin, the Mandalorian warrior portrayed by Pedro Pascal, whose face, hidden beneath that iconic Beskar helmet for much of the series, became one of the great visual motifs of streaming era television. Pascal's performance is an extraordinary technical achievement. He conveys warmth, weariness, determination, and tenderness primarily through posture, movement, and vocal delivery, since the audience rarely sees his face. That the character became as beloved as he did with Pascal's presence so strongly felt despite the helmet speaks to both the actor's skill and the writing's quality. Din Djarin is, at his core, a man shaped by loss and war who discovers through his relationship with Grogu something he had long since buried: the capacity to love and to be responsible for another living being. The Mandalorian Creed, "This is the way," is not merely a catchphrase but a philosophy of identity and belonging that Djarin both embodies and is constrained by, and watching him navigate that tension over 3 seasons is one of the quiet pleasures of the show. The relationship between Djarin and Grogu is ultimately the heart of everything. It is a story about parenthood, specifically about the way in which parenthood can arrive unexpectedly, can transform a person who thought they had no room for such transformation, and can demand sacrifices that redefine who you are. The Mandalorian is, in this reading, a story about a man who starts as a solitary mercenary operating entirely according to a strict code of personal honor, and who ends 3 seasons later as something much more complex: a father, a protector, a man who has been changed irrevocably by his love for a child who is not of his species, does not share his culture, and yet is undeniably completely his. That this emotional core has resonated so powerfully with audiences across the world is a testament to the universality of the story being told. Dressed up as it is in the galaxy's most iconic science fantasy iconography, when Alan F. Horn, then Walt Disney Studios chief creative officer, noted in November 2019, barely days after The Mandalorian premiered, that a theatrical film featuring Din Djarin could be developed if the series was a success, it seemed like a possibility rather than a plan. A month later, Favreau himself acknowledged the opportunity to expand the show's characters into feature films or spin off television series, framing it as something to be considered rather than something already in motion. The success of the show, however, was impossible to ignore, and the question was never really whether to make more Mandalorian content, but rather what form that content should take. through the show's second season, which aired in late 2020 and brought a dazzling parade of characters from the wider Star Wars universe into Jaren and Grogu's orbit, including the return of Luke Skywalker himself in a moment that reduced grown adults to tears across the globe, and through the third season in 2020, which concluded with Jaren formally agreeing to work for the New Republic. The appetite for more was never in question. Favreau began writing a fourth season of the show by late May 2022, and by February 2023, he and Filoni had completed those scripts together. The plan was straightforward: film the fourth season and continue the story on Disney Plus. But then the 2023 Hollywood labor disputes intervened. The combined strikes of the Writers Guild of America and the Screen Actors Guild brought production across the industry to a halt, and filming for The Mandalorian's fourth season, scheduled to begin in September 2023, was delayed indefinitely. During that enforced pause, a period of frustration for everyone in the industry, Lucasfilm took the opportunity to step back and reconsider the broader shape of what they were building. The decision that emerged from that reconsideration was bold. Instead of continuing to tell Djarin and Grogu's story on the small screen, they would bring it to theaters. In January 2024, Lucasfilm officially announced The Mandalorian and Grogu, with Favreau set to direct, co-write alongside Filoni and a third writer named Noah Clore, and produce alongside Kennedy, Filoni and veteran producer Ian Bryce. Clore's involvement was notable. He had previously co-written the Book of Boba Fett, the 2021-2022 spin-off series that expanded the Mandalorian universe, and had also co-written an episode of The Mandalorian itself with Favreau. His addition to the creative team was a signal that the film would be a genuine collaboration drawing on multiple perspectives. Pedro Pascal celebrated the announcement by sharing concept art on social media, his enthusiasm clearly genuine, though at the time it remained unclear exactly how involved he would be in physical production. His helmet obscured face meant that the character could technically be portrayed on set by other actors, while Pascal provided the voice, and some wondered whether his busy schedule, the second season of The Last of Us was in production, adding to his extraordinary workload, would allow for significant on-set presence. The film would be the first Star Wars theatrical release to move forward since Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker in 2019, which had concluded the so-called Skywalker saga. The years between 2019 and 2024 had been a period of genuine uncertainty for the franchise's film ambitions. Multiple projects had been announced and subsequently stalled, and the question of what Star Wars' future on the big screen would look like had become something of a running conversation in entertainment industry circles. The announcement of The Mandalorian and Grogu answered that question decisively. The future was these two characters, this story, this creative team. During an earnings call in February 2024, Disney CEO Bob Iger confirmed that the film would likely be released in 2026 and would inaugurate a new slate of Star Wars theatrical releases. That same month, California's Film Production Incentive Program allocated 21,755.00 in tax credits to the production, one of the largest allocations in the program's history. The film was projected to be produced entirely in California, marking the first time a Star Wars theatrical film would be made in the Golden State, and was expected to generate over $166 million in qualified expenditures and below-the-line wages there. In April 2024, Disney formally scheduled the film for release on May 22, 2026, filling a date that the studio had already reserved for an untitled Star Wars film. The machinery of one of entertainment's most significant productions was now in motion. Kathleen Kennedy, in explaining the decision to prioritize this film over other Star Wars projects, was characteristically precise about the strategic logic involved. The Mandalorian had built an audience for these characters through the Disney Plus platform, and she believed that younger audiences, children who had grown up with Grogu as one of their first Star Wars loves, would consider this film to be genuinely their Star Wars, a way into the franchise that did not require having seen everything that came before. The galaxy had been expanding for decades, with prequel trilogies and sequel trilogies and animated series, creating an increasingly complex web of continuity that could feel daunting to newcomers. But Grogu and The Mandalorian offered a point of entry that was simpler and more emotionally direct: a warrior and a child against the universe finding their way. You did not need to know what a midi-chlorian was to love them. Dave Filoni, who replaced Kennedy as Lucasfilm's co-CEO, echoed this sentiment while adding his own perspective. The Mandalorian and Grogu, he argued, did not carry the same pressure as Star Wars. The Force Awakens in 2015, which had been the first Star Wars film in a decade and had borne the weight of relaunching the entire franchise. That film had been the beginning of a new trilogy and the introduction of new central characters. This film, by contrast, was bringing back characters audiences already loved and telling a new chapter of a story already underway. Filoni described the film as a celebration of its two title characters, a chance to give them the full cinematic treatment they deserved. Jon Favreau's own framing of the transition from television series to theatrical feature is revealing. He noted that having written scripts for a fourth season, scripts that remain in existence and have not been discarded, did not mean those scripts were simply being transferred to the big screen. The change in format required fundamental reconception. A television season operates according to a different rhythm than a film. It can sustain subplots across multiple episodes, develop secondary characters over weeks, build toward a finale over hours of accumulated viewing. A film must do everything in roughly 2 hours, with the demands of theatrical pacing and structure that differ significantly from episodic storytelling. Favreau said the film became more of its own thing as a result of the restructuring necessary to make it work cinematically. He was candid in a way that was clearly designed to manage fan expectations while also being genuinely honest about what the planned fourth season would have contained. It would have featured a large ensemble of characters, would have centered significantly on Grand Admiral Thrawn and the broader storyline of that era of Star Wars history, and would have been explicitly designed to set up events depicted in the second season of Ahsoka, the spin-off series starring Rosario Dawson as the Jedi Ahsoka Tano. The connective tissue that Favreau and Filoni had planned for the television landscape had to be reconceived when the theatrical format became the priority. Elements were retained, the idea of Grogu as the Mandalorian's apprentice, central to both the abandoned season and the film, survived the transition, but the grand interconnected storyline had to be approached differently. Favreau was also explicit that the film's story is deliberately designed to be less reliant on knowledge of previous seasons than the show itself was, accommodating audiences who might be coming to these characters for the first time through a theatrical setting rather than having followed them from the beginning on Disney Plus. This intention of self-containment is important and speaks to a genuine philosophical choice. The history of franchise filmmaking is littered with sequels and spin-offs that assumed audience familiarity to the point of alienating casual viewers, and Favreau was clearly alert to that danger. At the same time, fans who had watched every episode of The Mandalorian, The Book of Boba Fett, and Ahsoka would find the film richly rewarding in ways that newcomers might not fully appreciate. A balance that is genuinely difficult to strike and that the creative team worked hard to achieve. Favreau articulated a vision of the film as something that could make contemporary young audiences feel about Star Wars the way he had felt about it growing up, as a universe of wonder and adventure that was theirs to enter and explore without the weight of accumulated mythology making the door feel too heavy to open. The film's working title during production was Thunder Alley, a name that appeared in production listings and suggested something of the film's tone with its evocation of speed, danger, and the kind of dusty kinetic energy that the best westerns communicate. The principal photography period was expected to span approximately 92 days, a substantial commitment that reflected the film's ambitions. It would involve approximately 54 cast members, an astonishing 3,500 background extras, and 500 crew members. These are figures befitting a major theatrical event, not a television production. Before cameras could roll, however, the production team came together. Production designers Doug Chiang and Andrew L. Jones, both veterans of the Mandalorian series and its various spin-offs, returned to help shape the visual world of the film. Chiang is one of the most respected designers in the history of franchise filmmaking, having worked on the Star Wars prequel trilogy and contributed enormously to the franchise's visual language over decades. Costume designer Mary Zophres, who had previously collaborated with Favreau on Iron Man 2 back in 2010, was brought in to handle the film's wardrobe, reuniting with the director after a 15-year gap. David Klein, who had served as cinematographer on the third season of The Mandalorian, returned in the same capacity for the film, providing continuity of visual approach from the series into the theatrical context. And Rachel Goodlett Katz, who had edited the third season, took on editing duties for the film, another instance of deliberate continuity in the crew. Sigourney Weaver entered talks to join the cast in May 2024, a piece of casting that generated enormous excitement. Weaver is one of the most iconic figures in science fiction film history. The alien battling Ellen Ripley is perhaps the definitive action heroine of the genre, and her addition to the Star Wars universe represented a genuine coup. She confirmed her casting publicly at the end of August 2024, and her role was subsequently revealed. She would play Ward, a colonel and leader of the New Republic's Adelphi Rangers, who had previously served as a pilot for the Rebel Alliance. It is a role that draws elegantly on Weaver's established screen persona as a capable, authoritative woman operating in physically demanding and often dangerous environments, and its placement within the New Republic infrastructure connect the film to the broader political landscape of this post-Empire era. Favreau and Filoni reported at Disney's D23 convention in early August 2024 that filming had begun weeks earlier than the public announcement, confirming that principal photography was underway. At D23, yes, they also revealed several pieces of information about the film that sent fans into paroxysms of excitement. The character Garazeb Zeb Aurelios, beloved from the animated series Star Wars Rebels, where he served as one of the founding members of the Ghost Crew, would be appearing in live action for the first time since his brief appearance in the third season of The Mandalorian. The Ancelan species, the tiny and endearing aliens first introduced in Star Wars, the rise of Skywalker and memorably represented by the Babu Frick character who won audiences' hearts in that film, would also be returning. And perhaps most thrillingly for fans who had grieved the loss in the second season, a new version of the Razor Crest, the Mandalorian's battered but beloved ship that was destroyed by Moff Gideon, would be appearing in the film. The Razor Crest's return is worth dwelling on briefly because it illustrates something important about how the creative team approaches the emotional dimensions of this story. The original ship's destruction in the second season was genuinely devastating for audiences who had come to regard it as a character in its own right, a tangible symbol of Jarin's solitary, self sufficient existence and his life before Grogu changed everything. The fact that a new version appears in the film is not simply a practical decision. The characters need a ship but an emotional one. The Mandalorian moving forward, rebuilding, choosing to continue living the life he has made with Grogu rather than being defined forever by what he lost. Filming concluded by the start of December 2024, completing a production period of roughly 4 to 5 months. During that time, additional casting was announced and revealed. In mid-December 2024, it was confirmed that Johnny Coyne would be reprising his role as the Imperial Warlord Janu, a character he had played in the third season of The Mandalorian. Janu is described as the leader of a faction of Galactic Empire remnants, one of the Imperial warlords who threatened the galaxy in the period following the Empire's fall. Also in December, Jeremy Allen White was announced as having been cast to provide the voice of Rota the Hutt, a character first introduced in the 2008 animated film Star Wars, The Clone Wars, as the infant son of crime lord Jabba the Hutt. White, who had risen to extraordinary prominence through his performance as Carmen Berzato in the critically acclaimed culinary drama The Bear, was an inspired and unexpected choice for a role that would require him to inhabit a very different kind of energy. The character of Rota the Hutt, as conceived for this film, represents a significant departure from the character's brief prior appearance. In the Clone Wars film, Rota was an infant nicknamed Stinky, who served primarily as a plot device in a story about his kidnapping and rescue. In The Mandalorian and Grogu, Rota is grown, a physical threat who participates in gladiator-style combat and speaks in both Galactic Basic, represented in the film by English, and Huttese, the guttural language of his species. White drew on Jabba's distinctive vocal qualities from previous Star Wars media as a foundation for his characterization while developing something entirely new. Favreau drew an illuminating comparison between Rota and Adonis Creed from the Creed film series. Both are characters who exist in the shadow of their famous fathers, who must forge their own identities in worlds shaped by those fathers' legacies. Jabba the Hutt is dead. killed by Leia Organa at the beginning of Return of the Jedi, and his criminal empire is presumably in disarray. What does a Hutt do in such circumstances? How does the son of the galaxy's most notorious crime lord make his own way? These are questions that would seem to promise rich material. Favreau himself described Rota's characterization as very different from his initial appearance in the Clone Wars, emphasizing that the character had grown into something genuinely formidable and unexpected. The premise that the New Republic enlist Jarin and Grogu to rescue Rota in exchange for information from the Hutt clan about a New Republic target is one of those pleasingly morally complicated setups that the best Star Wars stories favor. Both parties need something, neither fully trust the other, and the question of what it means to work for the good guys when those good guys are using the services of a bounty hunter who was himself working for the equivalent of organized crime is one that the film appears to engage with thoughtfully. At Star Wars Celebration Japan in April 2025, two further casting confirmations came. Weaver's role as Colonel Ward was officially detailed, connecting her to the New Republic's military structure and specifically to the Rebel Alliance pilots who formed the backbone of the resistance against the Empire. And Dave Filoni was revealed to be reprising his role as Trapper Wolf, the New Republic X-Wing pilot he had been playing in the show. Filoni's appearances as Trapper Wolf are something of a beloved tradition in Mandalorian circles. The co-creator inserting himself into the universe he has helped build with clear affection and a certain playful quality. The Star Wars Celebration Japan panel also featured Favreau, Kennedy, Pascal, and Weaver discussing the film in front of an audience of enthusiastic fans and was attended by an animatronic Grogu whose mere presence sent the crowd into raptures of delight. The film's official trailer arrived in February 2026, following a teaser in late September 2025 and a television spot during Super Bowl LX that generated a distinctly mixed reaction. The teaser trailer, released amid complicated circumstances, it had originally been planned for the previous week but was repeatedly delayed amid a Disney controversy related to the suspension of its ABC talk show Jimmy Kimmel Live. Generated enormous interest but was received with some ambivalence. Some critics felt it was too vague, too content to trade on the visual language of the show without demonstrating why the story merited a theatrical film rather than a fourth television season. Andrew Webster at The Verge, however, found it promising, noting that it suggested a combination of the adventurous spirit of the original Star Wars trilogy and the warmth and charm of The Mandalorian. James Hibbard at The Hollywood Reporter described it as having a different vibe from previous Star Wars films, considerably light-hearted and family-friendly, noting the prominent focus on Grogu and the fact that almost no human faces were clearly visible amid the parade of creatures, droids, and masked characters. Polygon's Michael McWhirter, meanwhile, declared simply that it promises lots of action. The Super Bowl LX television spot, which appeared during one of the most watched television events in the American calendar, was a deliberately unusual piece of marketing. Rather than a conventional film trailer, it was a parody of the classic Budweiser Super Bowl advertisements featuring the Budweiser Clydesdales. Those sentimental, lavishly produced spots that have become fixtures of the Super Bowl advertising landscape. In this version, Din Djarin and Grogu rode through snow on a wagon pulled by Tauntauns, the ice lizard creatures from The Empire Strikes Back, while a voiceover by the legendary Sam Elliott provided the warm, nostalgic narration. It was clever, warmly executed, and genuinely funny, but it was also, as many noted, with some frustration, not an actual trailer. Lucasfilm's marketing team defended the decision, stating they had wanted a unique and creative way to pay tribute to past Super Bowl advertising while reminding audiences of the fun, heart, and spectacle that defines Star Wars. Omar L. Gallagher of the Los Angeles Times placed it ninth in his ranking of the best Super Bowl LX advertisements, noting its cleverness while adding that even those not particularly excited about seeing Baby Yoda on the big screen had to concede the spot felt at home in its Super Bowl setting. Eric Diaz at Nerdist found it wholesome and adorable, comparing it to a Christmas card. Ryan Scott and Polly Poisson at Film were significantly less charitable, calling it the worst Star Wars spot they had ever seen. Polygon's Amy Hart was also disappointed, feeling that Lucasfilm and Disney had missed an opportunity to make a stronger case for the film's theatrical release during one of the year's most prominent advertising platforms. James Whitbrook at Gizmodo was characteristically thoughtful in his analysis, noting that the show's marketing had always prioritized atmosphere over plot revelation and that the film's campaign had been consistent with that approach, but questioning whether the same strategy that worked for a weekly streaming series made sense for the first Star Wars theatrical release in 7 years. The full trailer, arriving in mid February 2026, went some way toward addressing those concerns, though it still kept significant plot elements close to its chest. Multiple critics and commentators expressed relief at finally having a proper look at the film. The trailer confirmed several revelations that generated significant discussion. Most notably, it was clear that Din Djarin would be unmasked during the film, that Pedro Pascal's face would be clearly visible at some point, a departure from the Mandalorian creed that prohibits removing the helmet. This was a development that Favreau and Pascal had clearly thought about carefully. The third season of the show had already dealt with the helmet question, with Jarin doing penance for having previously allowed his face to be seen. The decision to unmask him again in the film was, according to Favreau, not made lightly, representing a conscious balancing act between the established lore and the practical desire to show more of Pascal's face, to give audiences the full presence of one of the most charismatic actors working today. Pascal himself felt the unmasking was justified within the story of the film. The trailer also confirmed the appearance of Embo, the Cuso bounty hunter, originally from the Clone Wars animated series, and revealed that Martin Scorsese would be providing the voice of an Ardennian shopkeeper. The Martin Scorsese casting deserves a moment of extended reflection because it exists within a fascinating cultural context. Scorsese is one of the most celebrated filmmakers in cinema history, but he is also the man who sparked a years long controversy about the relationship between franchise filmmaking and genuine cinematic art when he declared that Marvel superhero films were not cinema. His comments generated enormous debate and considerable pushback from fans, filmmakers, and cultural commentators who argued that spectacle and depth were not mutually exclusive. Jon Favreau, who had directed the first two Iron Man films and thus played a foundational role in establishing the Marvel Cinematic Universe, was among those who pushed back. Having Scorsese appear as a voice actor in The Mandalorian and Grogu, a film that is unambiguously a spectacle driven franchise production, reads, in the words of Polygon's Matt Patches, as an attempt to find common ground between the world of prestige filmmaking and the world of blockbuster entertainment. Whether one finds this charming or cynical likely depends on one's prior position in that debate. The final trailer, released in April 2026 following Favreau's presentation at CinemaCon, where he also screened the first 17 minutes of the film for industry attendees, generated the strongest positive reaction of any marketing material to date. Gizmodo's Whitbrook called it a much better look at the film than anything we've had before, specifically highlighting the action sequences and the deployment of John Williams' beloved themes from the earlier Star Wars films. Den of Geeks Joe George suggested the film had the potential to be a genuine crowd pleaser that could wash away the negative feelings left by the rise of Skywalker, provided Favreau managed to successfully integrate all the diverse elements the trailer showcased. William Hughes at the AV Club highlighted the Anselans and Sigourney Weaver as particular selling points for casual viewers who were not already devoted followers of the Mandalorian series. In late April, Pascal and Favreau made surprise appearances at CCXP Mexico, where they screened the film's opening minutes for another audience of enthusiastic fans. The film features something that will be a first in the history of Star Wars theatrical releases: opening credits. Every Star Wars film since 1977 has begun with the famous crawling text that sets the scene, followed immediately by the film's action. The absence of traditional opening credits has always been part of the franchise's house style, part of what makes a Star Wars film recognizably itself. The decision to include opening credits in The Mandalorian and Grogu signals that this film, while firmly part of the franchise, is doing something new, establishing its own identity rather than simply following established conventions. The credits, according to reporting from Gizmodo, may also contain significant plot clues, adding another layer of meaning to what might otherwise seem like a straightforward formal choice. The film will be presented in IMAX with approximately 49 minutes of footage filmed in the full frame IMAX ratio. a significant portion of the film's 132-minute running time, and a clear indication that this is being positioned as a genuine theatrical event rather than simply a long episode of the television series. The utilization of IMAX cameras and the expanded aspect ratio they allow means that certain sequences will fill the screen in a way that even the most sophisticated home theater cannot fully replicate, making the theatrical experience genuinely distinct. The production design philosophy for the film, as Favreau has described it, draws inspiration from unexpected sources. He and his team looked to Flash Gordon, specifically the 1954 television series, as a reference point for the visual world they were creating. This is a choice with deep roots in Star Wars' own history. George Lucas has always acknowledged the influence of classic science fiction serials, including Flash Gordon, on his original conception of the franchise. By returning to that well, Favreau is in some sense going back to the beginning, connecting the film to the franchise's founding inspirations while creating something that feels distinctly contemporary. The expanded resources available for theatrical production also allowed the team to build physical sets and use locations that the series' production schedule and budget had not permitted. Favreau specifically noted having access to more backlot space and additional stages, enabling the creation of environments that had simply not been possible within the constraints of the television format. The action and spectacle of the film are, according to both Favreau and Filoni, significantly expanded from what the series was able to offer. This is perhaps the most obvious way in which a theatrical Star Wars film can differentiate itself from its streaming origins. The scale and ambition of set pieces, the size and complexity of the worlds being depicted, the sheer visual density of what appears on screen. Filoni, who directed the film's second unit, brought his own deep knowledge of action choreography and visual storytelling to the production. Both he and Favreau emphasized, however, that spectacle alone is not what makes these characters and this story work. The emotional connection between Din Djarin and Grogu, the relationship that has defined The Mandalorian from its very first episode, is what audiences are ultimately there for, and no amount of impressive action choreography or jaw-dropping visual effects can substitute for that. The larger canvas of theatrical filmmaking is in service of the characters, not the other way around. Tippett Studio, the legendary visual effects and animation company founded by Phil Tippett, provided stop-motion animation for the film. This is a remarkable creative decision that deserves attention. Stop-motion animation is one of the oldest film technologies, predating computer graphics by many decades, and its characteristic quality, the subtle, slightly uncanny quality of movement that distinguishes it from both live action and digital animation, evokes a specific kind of nostalgic wonder. Tippett Studio was responsible, among many other things, for the creature effects in the original Star Wars films, the chess-playing holographic monsters, the Gamorrean guards, the Jabba's palace denizens. The studio's return to the franchise for this film is thus freighted with history, a deliberate invocation of the original film's practical effects sensibility at a moment when digital visual effects dominate the industry. Ludwig Göransson's involvement as composer was confirmed in September 2025, and it represents a continuity of one of the film's most important creative elements. Göransson composed the scores for the first two seasons of The Mandalorian and provided thematic material for the third, and his work on those seasons is widely regarded as some of the finest scoring in the franchise's history since John Williams established its musical identity. The Mandalorian's main theme, haunting, minimalist, built around guitar and unusual percussion, is one of the most instantly recognizable pieces of music from any streaming-era television show. Its presence in the film, presumably expanded and developed for the theatrical context, will be a major component of the film's emotional architecture. Göransson's scoring sessions took place during the first half of January 2026 at the Fox Studio lot in Los Angeles, and the resulting music will be released in multiple formats. A digital soundtrack album through Walt Disney Records on May 15, a 12-inch vinyl album featuring 13 cues on June 5th, and in a piece of fan-focused marketing that is delightful in its specificity, a special edition 10-inch vinyl in the shape of the Mandalorian's helmet, featuring two new score cues releasing on May 20, the film's opening day. The broader narrative context in which The Mandalorian and Grogu takes place is the period following the fall of the Galactic Empire, a time of political and military instability that the Star Wars franchise has increasingly explored over recent years, filling in what was previously a largely blank space between the events of Return of the Jedi and those of The Force Awakens. The New Republic, the democratic government that emerged from the rebellion's victory over the Empire, is the governing authority of the galaxy in this era, but its rule is contested. Imperial warlords, military commanders who survived the Empire's collapse and refused to accept its defeat, continue to operate in various regions of the galaxy, threatening peace and stability. The Empire Remnant, led by Janu, portrayed by Johnny Coyne, represents one such faction, and presumably its activities create one of the conflicts that drive the film's plot. The New Republic itself, as depicted in The Mandalorian, is not an unambiguous force for good. It is a young government still finding its footing, sometimes naive about the threats it faces, occasionally bureaucratic in its responses to urgent crises. Sigourney Weaver's Colonel Ward, as leader of the Adelphi Rangers, represents a part of the New Republic that is more proactive, more willing to get its hands dirty in pursuit of justice and stability. The fact that the New Republic enlists Jarin and Grogu for a mission involving Rota the Hutt suggests that even the good guys are willing to engage with the murky realities of post war politics when necessary. This moral complexity is characteristic of the best Star Wars storytelling, which has always been most interesting when it acknowledges that the world cannot be neatly divided into light and dark. The mission structure, Jarin and Grogu tasked with rescuing Rota in exchange for information, is classic genre storytelling, with its echoes of the heist film and the mission movie, the western and the samurai narrative. But within that structure, the film appears to develop the evolution of Din Djarin's character in ways that grow naturally from where the series left him. By the end of the third season, Jarin had formally agreed to work for the New Republic, a significant departure from his earlier status as a lone operator beholden to no institution. Pascal has spoken about this development, noting that it gives the character the opportunity to combine his formidable bounty hunter skills with his moral convictions to do what he knows is right within a framework that supports that choice. He is, as Favreau described it, making the transition from the man hunting down bounties for pay to the man pursuing the wanted posters on behalf of something larger than himself. The sheriff rather than the hired gun, though retaining all of the gunfighter's skills and identity. Grogu's position in the film as the Mandalorian's apprentice is central to the story. The idea of the apprentice relationship of one generation passing knowledge and skill to the next is deeply embedded in both the Star Wars mythology and in the Western and samurai genres that influence it. Master and apprentice, father and son, mentor and student. These are ancient story structures that continue to resonate because they speak to fundamental human experiences of learning, growing, and being shaped by those who came before. In the case of Jarin and Grogu, the relationship is further complicated by Grogu's unusual nature. He is, by any measure, an extraordinary being, force sensitive in ways that go far beyond ordinary Jedi potential, ancient in some sense that the show has gestured at without fully explaining, and possessed of abilities that exceed what his appearance as a small green infant might suggest. Training Grogu is not simply a matter of teaching him the Mandalorian creed, though that is part of it. It is a matter of helping a genuinely singular being find his place in the world. The film will also mark the continuation of the wider Star Wars universe's expansion into territory that was once the exclusive province of animation. The appearance of characters like Embo and Zeb Aurelius in live action form continues a process that The Mandalorian pioneered and that the entire Disney plus Star Wars universe has pursued with increasing ambition, bringing beloved animated characters into photorealistic contexts, allowing audiences who knew them only as drawings to encounter them in a physical form that feels more tangible, more present. For fans of the Clone Wars and Rebels, these appearances carry enormous emotional weight. Embo, for instance, is one of the most distinctive and memorable bounty hunters in the expanded Star Wars universe. A hulking alien who uses his broad-brimmed hat as both weapon and shield, and whose fighting style is among the most kinetically exciting in all of Star Wars animation. Seeing him in live action is a genuine event for a significant portion of the audience. The casting of Martin Scorsese, beyond its meta-cultural implications, is also simply a delightful piece of creative mischief. An Ardenian, the species to which the beloved character Rio Durant from Solo, a Star Wars story belongs, a four-armed alien with a rough and ready adventurous spirit, is precisely the kind of character you would expect to find in a cantina or a marketplace on the fringes of the galaxy, doing something slightly dodgy and being charming about it. The idea of Scorsese's voice, so associated with the intense, morally fraught world of American crime cinema, emerging from such a creature has a quality of gleeful incongruity that suggests the filmmakers are entirely capable of having fun with their casting choices. The film's release also comes at a moment of significant transition for Lucasfilm. Kathleen Kennedy, who has presided over the company since 2012 and oversaw the creation of both the Disney era sequel trilogy and the entire streaming Star Wars universe, has been in the process of transitioning her role, with Dave Filoni having ascended to the position of co-CEO of the studio. Kennedy herself, while actively involved in The Mandalorian and Grogu as a producer, has acknowledged that the landscape of the franchise is changing. The next generation of Star Wars leadership is taking the helm at a moment when the franchise is pivoting back toward theatrical filmmaking after its streaming focused years, and the choices being made about which stories to tell first will define the franchise's direction for years to come. The decision to lead with The Mandalorian and Grogu rather than any of the other Star Wars film projects that have been in various stages of development over the years, including a Charmin Obaid Chinoy directed film featuring Daisy Ridley's Rey and various other announced projects, reflects a calculated assessment of audience appetite and commercial potential. Jaren and Grogu are, by any measure, the most beloved new Star Wars characters of the Disney era and possibly of the entire franchise's post-original trilogy history. Their story has an established audience that is both large and intensely devoted. The emotional foundation is already in place. The task is simply to give those characters the biggest possible canvas on which to continue their journey. The question of whether a fourth season of The Mandalorian will ever be made remains genuinely open. Favreau has confirmed the existence of those completed scripts and has spoken about the ways in which the film has absorbed and transformed some of what they contained while leaving other elements aside. Whether the success of the film leads to further theatrical sequels, a renewed television series, or some combination of both remains to be seen. Filoni has suggested that a successful first film could be followed by sequels, making The Mandalorian and Grogu the beginning of its own film series rather than a one-off theatrical event. This seems both commercially logical and creatively appealing. There is clearly no shortage of story to tell, but the shape that continuation might take will depend heavily on how the first film performs and how audiences respond to it. The anticipation for The Mandalorian and Grogu, measured across social media enthusiasm, box office pre-sale trajectories, and industry buzz, is of a magnitude that suggests a significant cultural event. The marketing campaign, despite its mixed reception, particularly around the Super Bowl spot and the slow burn approach of the early teasers, has steadily built awareness and excitement, and the full trailer's release provided the more concrete look at the film that many had been waiting for. The CinemaCon screening of the first 17 minutes reportedly generated intense enthusiasm among the industry insiders who saw it, a positive sign for the film's prospects with general audiences. There's something genuinely moving about the fact that this film exists at all. The Mandalorian arrived at a moment when Star Wars was in a complicated place. The sequel trilogy had concluded with a film that left a significant portion of the fanbase feeling deflated. The ambitious plans for multiple new theatrical films had stalled or been cancelled, and questions about the long-term health of the franchise were being asked with increasing frequency. What The Mandalorian provided was a reminder of what had made people love Star Wars in the first place. The sense of vast, exciting possibility in the galaxy, the adventures of compelling characters who felt genuinely alive, the thrill of encountering new worlds and new creatures and new stories within a universe that had been part of the cultural furniture since the late 1970s. And Grogu provided something even more specific. A character who could make adults feel for a moment like children again, who could bypass the accumulated cynicism and disappointment and remind viewers of the simple primary pleasure of caring about a fictional creature. That Din Djarin and Grogu should now be moving from a streaming platform to movie theaters, that their story should be considered important enough, significant enough, beloved enough to warrant the full theatrical treatment is a validation of everything that The Mandalorian set out to achieve when it debuted in November 2019. It is also, in a broader sense, a story about how storytelling works in the contemporary media landscape. How a television series can build an audience, develop characters, and create emotional bonds that eventually transcend the original format of their creation and demand a larger stage. The film exists within a rich web of connections to the broader Star Wars universe that rewards those who have followed the franchise closely while not requiring that knowledge to be fully appreciated. The presence of characters from Clone Wars, Rebels, The Mandalorian, The Book of Boba Fett, and The Rise of Skywalker creates a tapestry of connections that is genuinely exciting for longtime fans. The New Republic political framework, the Imperial Remnant threat, the Hutt crime underworld, the Mandalorian culture, and its complicated codes of honor. These are all elements that have been developed over years of storytelling and that the film can draw on with depth and confidence. But at its center, The Mandalorian and Grogu is and will always be about two beings who found each other in the outer reaches of the galaxy and chose against all expectation and convention to become a family. Din Djarin, the warrior shaped by the Mandalorian creed, who had closed himself off from attachment and vulnerability in the name of that creed, and Grogu, the ancient young being of unknown origin and extraordinary potential, who needed a protector and found instead a father. Their story is not a story about wars between empires or the fate of the galaxy, though those things provide its backdrop. It is a story about the transformative power of love and responsibility, about what happens to a person when they stop moving through the world alone and start moving through it with someone else. As May 23, 2026 approaches, the anticipation is palpable. Fans who have been following these characters since 2019 are eager to see them on the biggest possible screen, with the full resources of theatrical filmmaking behind them. New audiences encountering Din Djarin and Grogu for the first time in a movie theater will have the experience of discovering two of the most compelling characters in contemporary popular fiction. And for those who have been there from the beginning, who remember the moment the child first appeared on screen in that first episode, who felt the joy and the sadness and the wonder of those 3 seasons, the film will be something else again. A homecoming, an arrival, a fulfillment of a journey that began with the simplest of premises and became somehow one of the great stories of its era. The galaxy is wide, the adventures are vast, and Din Djarin and Grogu are ready for the next chapter. This is the way what makes the emergence of this film so particularly resonant as a cultural moment is the manner in which it captures the evolution of Star Wars itself as an institution. When the franchise was first conceived by George Lucas in the mid 1970s, it was a singular creative vision translated into a theatrical experience that redefined what movies could be. The original trilogy, A New Hope, The Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi established the template for modern blockbuster filmmaking and created a mythology that embedded itself in the global imagination with a thoroughness matched by few creative works in history. The prequels, whatever one's feelings about their particular qualities, were also theatrical events of enormous cultural significance, arriving in theaters to audiences who had waited for years and who experienced them as shared public rituals. The sequel trilogy continued this tradition of theatrical Star Wars, though with a creative turbulence that left the franchise's theatrical future uncertain by the time it concluded. The streaming era, inaugurated for Star Wars by The Mandalorian, represented something genuinely new, the translation of the franchise's mythological weight into a format that was at once more intimate and more episodic. Where theatrical Star Wars had always been about grand events, battles that decided the fate of galaxies, chosen ones fulfilling ancient prophecies, streaming Star Wars could afford to be smaller, more focused on the particular lives of particular people navigating a universe larger than themselves. Din Djarin is not the chosen one. He is not destined to restore balance to the Force, or defeat the ultimate evil. He is a man doing a job, operating according to a code, and then being undone and remade by an encounter with a being who needed him. This is precisely the kind of story that the streaming format, with its ability to develop characters slowly over hours of accumulated viewing time, is ideally suited to tell. But there is something about Star Wars that has always belonged to the theatrical experience, to the darkness of the cinema, the communal experience of the crowd, the scale of the screen, the physical sensation of the sound. The moment when a Star Wars film begins, when the lights go down and the familiar fanfare erupts and the title appears against a starfield, is a ritual that exists nowhere else in contemporary popular culture with quite the same intensity of collective emotional investment. Bringing Jarin and Grogu into that context is not simply a commercial decision, though it is certainly that. It is a statement that this story has earned its place in the great tradition of theatrical Star Wars, that these characters have proved themselves worthy of the biggest possible stage. The fact that the film will be released in IMAX with roughly 40% of its running time filmed in the expanded IMAX format reinforces this commitment to the theatrical experience as something qualitatively different from home viewing. Favreau and Filoni are not simply transferring their television aesthetic to a larger screen. They are genuinely reconceiving the visual and spatial language of the story to take advantage of what theatrical presentation uniquely offers. Action sequences that were already impressive in the series will be, according to the filmmakers, expanded in ambition and scale. The worlds through which Jorin and Grogu travel will be rendered with a physical density and visual richness that the series, for all its technical achievements, could not fully match. The score deserves further consideration as a crucial element of the film's emotional architecture. Ludwig Göransson's work on the first two seasons of The Mandalorian established a distinctive sonic identity for this corner of the Star Wars universe, one that drew on the franchise's established musical language while creating something genuinely new. Where John Williams' original Star Wars scores are characterized by their orchestral grandeur, their operatic sweep, and their explicit evocation of classical European concert music, Goransson's Mandalorian score is more minimalist, more influenced by the films of Ennio Morricone and the sparse atmospheric music of the Western genre, with its use of unusual timbres, unconventional rhythms, and a fondness for the guitar as a melodic instrument. This sonic universe perfectly matches the show's visual and narrative register. The outer rim of the galaxy, far from the centers of power, where a man on a ship navigates in solitude. The translation of this musical sensibility to a theatrical context, with the larger orchestra, more resources, and the specific demands of a 2 hour narrative rather than episodic storytelling, is one of the most interesting creative challenges the film presents. The scoring sessions at the Fox Studio lot in January 2026 produced music that will be heard for the first time by general audiences on May 22nd. The multiple vinyl releases planned around the film's opening suggest confidence that this music will be something audiences want to return to and own, a sign that the score is expected to be as significant a component of the film's identity as its visuals or its story. The character development that the film undertakes for Din Djarin, specifically the decision to unmask him, carries implications that extend beyond the simple revelation of Pedro Pascal's face. The helmet has been the central symbol of Djarin's identity throughout the series. It is the visible sign of his adherence to the Mandalorian creed, the physical barrier between himself and the world, the thing that both protects him and isolates him. The creed's prohibition against removing the helmet in the presence of others is not arbitrary. It reflects a philosophy of identity in which the self is defined entirely by one's code and one's actions rather than one's appearance. By removing the helmet and by doing so in a context that Favreau and Pascal both describe as fully justified by the story, the film is making a statement about how far Djarin has come. He is no longer a man who defines himself entirely by his code. He is a man who has a relationship, a responsibility, a child, and who has been changed by all of those things in ways that make the old armor both necessary and insufficient. The 3 season arc of The Mandalorian, viewed retrospectively, is a story about a man progressively becoming more human, not in any literal biological sense, but in the sense of becoming more fully embedded in the web of relationships, obligations, and vulnerabilities that constitute a human life. He begins as someone who has reduced his existence to a code and a mission, who keeps the world at arm's length through a literal metal visor. He ends as someone who has a son who has led the reclamation of an entire people's homeworld and who has committed himself to working within a political structure larger than himself. The film takes up his story at this stage of his evolution and asks, apparently, what does this man look like when he fully embraces who he has become? The broader question of what The Mandalorian and Grogu means for the future of Star Wars as a franchise is one that the industry will be watching closely. The film arrives at a moment when the franchise has an opportunity to re-establish itself as a major theatrical force after years in which its primary story delivery mechanism has been the streaming series. A successful film measured not just in box office terms but in terms of audience enthusiasm, critical reception, and the sense that the franchise has recaptured the quality and energy of its best work, would open the door to a new era of Star Wars cinema. An unsuccessful one or one perceived as merely adequate would raise difficult questions about whether the theatrical format is truly the right home for these characters and this story. The creative team's confidence is evident in every aspect of what has been shared about the film. The expanded scale of its production, the ambition of its visual design, the quality of its cast, the care and thought that has gone into translating the television story into a theatrical one. Favreau and Filoni are two of the most deeply knowledgeable and genuinely passionate custodians the Star Wars universe has ever had, and their collaboration has produced some of the franchise's finest work. The presence of Kathleen Kennedy as a producer, even as she transitions out of her leadership role, provides continuity of oversight from someone who has guided the franchise through both its greatest recent triumphs and its most significant challenges. The audience waiting for The Mandalorian and Grogu is an audience that wants to be transported. They want to sit in the dark and be taken to a galaxy far, far away and be reminded of why they fell in love with Star Wars in the first place. They want to see Din Djarin and Grogu together on a screen bigger than any screen they have seen them on before. They want the emotional experience of that relationship, the warmth and the humor and the genuine tenderness of a warrior and his child against the universe, amplified to cinematic scale. They want the action and the adventure and the sense of wonder that Star Wars has always been able to provide at its best. On May 22nd, 2026, they will get their chance to judge whether The Mandalorian and Grogu delivers on its extraordinary promise. The Force, as they say, will be with us. It always has been. The deeper one looks into the cultural phenomenon that Grogu represents, the more fascinating the analysis becomes. In an entertainment landscape that was, by 2019, awash in spectacle, the character worked through something almost antithetical to spectacle: smallness, stillness, vulnerability. In a franchise built on epic confrontations between the forces of darkness and light, on galaxy spanning conflicts and the destinies of chosen individuals, the most compelling thing Lucasfilm had produced in years was a tiny creature with large eyes who occasionally lifted rocks with his mind and had a fondness for eating soup frogs. The cultural instinct that immediately christened this character Baby Yoda, despite the fact that he is neither a baby in any meaningful developmental sense nor Yoda himself, was a collective act of recognition that something genuinely new had arrived, something that bypassed the usual mechanisms of franchise affection and operated at a more primal level. The psychology of audience attachment to Grogu is worth examining in some detail because it illuminates something important about how storytelling works and why this particular character has proven so extraordinarily durable in his appeal. At the most basic level, the character triggers what behavioral scientists call kinchenshima, the suite of physical features associated with infant faces and young animals that instinctively provoke nurturing and protective responses in humans. Large eyes relative to face size, a rounded cranium, small nose and mouth, soft features, all of these cues are present in Grogu's design, amplified and concentrated into a form that presses every evolutionary button simultaneously. This is not accidental, it is the result of extraordinarily skilled design work, drawing on decades of accumulated understanding about what makes a puppet or animated character feel alive and appealing to human audiences. The physical production of Grogu, the animatronic puppet, operated by a team of skilled puppeteers and augmented with digital effects, was designed from the ground up to maximize this appeal while also giving the character the expressive range needed to function as a genuine dramatic presence rather than simply a cute object. But cute design alone does not explain the depth of attachment audiences found with this character. E.T. was also cute and has endured as one of cinema's most beloved creations, but the nature of the attachment to E.T. is somewhat different from that to Grogu. E.T. is primarily an emotional presence, a being whose vulnerability and longing for home create a sympathy that is essentially passive. The audience loves E.T. because they feel for him, because his situation is heartbreaking and his eventual departure devastating. Grogu's appeal includes these elements but adds something else: agency. Even as a very small creature, Grogu acts. He reaches for things, he makes choices. He demonstrates preferences. He is, despite his apparent helplessness, a being with a distinct personality, curious, mischievous, greedy in an endearing way, capable of both courage and fear, prone to the most magnificently timed comedic reactions. He is funny, and this humor is not condescending or infantilizing but genuinely characterful. The humor of a being who sees the universe with fresh eyes and responds to it with unconstrained immediacy. The relationship between Grogu's comedy and his drama is one of the most sophisticated aspects of the character's construction. The Mandalorian is adept at deploying Grogu as comic relief without ever reducing him to a mere joke. In the same episode, the same scene, sometimes the character can provoke genuine laughter and genuine tears. This tonal range is extraordinarily difficult to achieve with any character, but achieving it with a character who never speaks, who communicates entirely through expression, sound, and action, is a remarkable feat of collaborative storytelling. The writers who created the scenarios, the directors who staged them, and the puppeteers and effects artists who brought Grogu to life all had to be operating at a consistently high level to produce these moments, and the consistency of that quality across 3 seasons of television speaks well for the collaborative culture of the production. The voice, or rather the absence of voice, is central to how Grogu functions. The decision not to give the character dialogue was a fundamental creative choice and one that Kathleen Kennedy has specifically highlighted. A character who speaks can explain themselves, can assert their perspective, can narrate their experience. A character who does not speak must be understood through context, through implication, through the responses of the characters around them, and the expressive resources available to their physical presence. This forces the audience to actively participate in the construction of the character's inner life, to project meaning onto those large expressive eyes and those small gestures. It creates a form of audience investment that is different from and arguably deeper than what is achieved through dialogue, because the audience becomes co creators of the character's experience rather than passive recipients of information about it. This is why the question of whether Grogu will ever speak, a question that has been present since the character's introduction and has occasionally been addressed in interviews, feels so charged. Kennedy has confirmed that Grogu does not speak in The Mandalorian and Grogu, and the phrasing of that confirmation, specifically the reference to a power he will not have in the new film, suggests that the question of speech has been consciously considered and deliberately deferred rather than simply neglected. Whether Grogu will ever speak and what it would mean for the character if he did is one of the lingering mysteries of the saga, and its resolution or continuation in future installments will be one of the most consequential creative decisions the storytellers face. The narrative arc that leads into The Mandalorian and Grogu from the 3 seasons of the television series is worth recounting in some detail for those who may be coming to this analysis without a comprehensive knowledge of the show. Din Djarin begins the series as a lone bounty hunter operating in the outer rim of the galaxy, years after the fall of the Galactic Empire. He is a member of a cohort of Mandalorians who follow a particularly strict interpretation of the Way of the Mandalore, a set of cultural practices that includes the prohibition against removing the helmet. The Mandalorians who raised Djarin were survivors of a violent historical trauma, the Night of a Thousand Tears, in which Imperial forces massacred the population of Mandalore, and their strict adherence to the helmet rule is connected to that history in ways the series gradually reveals. Jarin is sent on a mission by a mysterious client connected to the remnants of the Empire to retrieve the asset and discovers that the asset is an infant of Yoda species, perhaps 50 years old but developmentally comparable to a human toddler, extraordinary in his force sensitivity. Jarin's code would have him simply deliver the child and collect his payment, but his conscience, shaped by his own experience as an orphan taken in by the Mandalorians as a child, will not allow him to abandon this infant to a fate he cannot condone. He retrieves Grogu from the Imperial facility and goes on the run, becoming the child's protector over the first season as they evade both the Imperial remnant and the bounty hunters pursuing them. Over the course of two further seasons, the relationship deepens and the stakes escalate. The second season introduces characters from across the Star Wars universe: Ahsoka Tano, Bo-Katan Kryze, Boba Fett, Fennec Shand, Cara Dune, Greef Karga, and expands the world of the Outer Rim considerably. Grogu's name is revealed, as is his connection to the Jedi and the fact that he has been alive since before the Clone Wars, making him a being of genuinely ancient lineage who has witnessed the full arc of the conflict between the Jedi and the Sith. The season concludes with one of the most emotionally powerful moments in all of Star Wars: Grogu being taken by newly arrived Luke Skywalker to be trained as a Jedi, and Jaren, in order to communicate with the child before his departure, removing his helmet for the first time in the series. A violation of the Creed, but an act of love that the Creed cannot accommodate. The third season navigates the consequences of that parting and the subsequent reunion. Grogu chooses, when offered the option by Luke Skywalker, to return to Jaren rather than continue Jedi training, a choice that encapsulates the thematic heart of the story. Given the choice between the path of the Jedi, with its demands of attachment free discipline and service to the Force, and the path of being with the person who loves him, Grogu chooses love. This is a radical act within the Star Wars mythology, which has traditionally framed Jedi attachment as a path to the dark side, and it signals something important about what kind of story The Mandalorian is telling, one in which attachment is not the enemy of wisdom but its foundation. The third season also sees the resolution of the Mandalore storyline, with Din Djarin participating in the effort to reclaim the Mandalorian homeworld and restore the culture to its full glory. He undergoes friends required by the armorer, the leader of his covert, played by Emily Swallows, for having removed his helmet, bathing in the living waters of Mandalore, and is formally welcomed back into the fold. The season ends with both Jaren and Grogu in good standing within the Mandalorian community, with Jaren having accepted a formal working relationship with the New Republic, and with the broader threat of Moff Gideon's Imperial remnant apparently resolved. The film picks up from this relatively settled state, but the galaxy, as the story makes clear, always has fresh complications to offer. The political landscape of the New Republic era is, as depicted in The Mandalorian and its spin offs, a landscape of managed instability. The Empire fell, but empires do not disappear cleanly. They fragment and linger, their remnants creating pockets of resistance and tyranny across the galaxy for years afterward. The New Republic, committed to democracy and decentralization in response to the Empire's totalitarian centralization, is perhaps too cautious in asserting its authority in the Outer Rim, leaving the fringes of the galaxy to fend largely for themselves. This political geography is exactly the terrain that The Mandalorian has always explored most effectively. The places that institutions forget, where the old rules no longer apply and the new rules have not yet arrived, where individuals with personal codes must navigate moral landscapes that official structures cannot map. Into this landscape comes the mission of the Mandalorian and Grogu, a rescue operation that requires working with one of the galaxy's established criminal dynasties, the Hutts, in exchange for information that the New Republic needs. It is the kind of arrangement that no republic would openly endorse and that any realistic government would quietly pursue, and the film's willingness to engage with this moral complexity speaks well for its ambitions. Rota the Hutt, the son of the late unlamented Jabba, is not simply a villain or simply an ally, but apparently something more interesting. A character in his own right, a young Hutt trying to establish himself in a world where his father's shadow falls heavily, and where the structures that supported his family's criminal empire have been disrupted by the same war that disrupted everyone else's world. Jeremy Allen White's performance as the voice of Rota is expected to be one of the film's major revelations. White is an actor of considerable gifts whose work in The Bear demonstrated a capacity for portraying the emotional life of a character under enormous pressure with a specificity and depth that is genuinely affecting. Bringing those skills to a character who is physically a large alien slug, who speaks two languages, and who carries the genetic and cultural weight of one of Star Wars' most iconic figures is a challenge that White appears to have approached with characteristic commitment. The comparison Favreau drew between Rota and Adonis Creed is illuminating. Both characters are defined by their relationship to an overwhelmingly famous father, and both are trying to prove themselves in arenas where their father's legacy both opens doors and creates impossible expectations. Whether Rota is ultimately a hero, a villain, or something more complicated is one of the questions the film will answer. The Mandalorian and Grogu was produced at a time of significant technological evolution in how Star Wars is made. The original series was famously one of the first major productions to use the stagecraft technology, also known as the volume, developed by Industrial Light and Magic, which uses massive curved LED screens to create immersive digital backgrounds in real time rather than relying on green screen. This technology was revolutionary when The Mandalorian deployed it, allowing actors to perform in physically convincing environments rendered digitally, with lighting that responded to the digital backgrounds and created far more realistic integration than green screen typically allows. The film, operating with a larger budget and the expanded resources of theatrical production, will presumably take full advantage of this and related technologies while also building more physical sets and practical environments than the series could accommodate. Favreau's reference to being able to use more backlot space and additional stages is significant in this context. The series, despite its technical innovations, was constrained by the realities of television production budgets and schedules. A theatrical film with a major studio investment behind it can afford to build entire worlds in practical space, to construct architecture that actors can physically inhabit, that directors and cinematographers can light and compose within, that gives the performances a tactile grounding that even the most sophisticated digital environment cannot fully replicate. The combination of expanded practical production with the latest in digital filmmaking tools should produce a visual richness that goes well beyond what the series achieved, visually spectacular as that often was. The decision to film approximately 49 minutes of the film in the full frame IMAX ratio represents a commitment to a specific kind of theatrical experience. IMAX cameras capture more of the visual field than conventional film cameras, and full frame IMAX, in which the entire aperture of the film is used rather than the widescreen portion, fills the enormous screens of IMAX theaters from top to bottom in a way that is genuinely overwhelming. When this format is used for specific sequences in a film that is otherwise is in the conventional widescreen ratio, the expansion of the frame at key moments creates a physical sensation of opening, of the world suddenly becoming larger. Used deliberately, as the best IMAX filmmakers use it, this can be an extraordinarily effective storytelling tool, aligning the expansion of the visual field with moments of emotional expansion or narrative climax. The fact that nearly 40% of The Mandalorian and Grogu will be presented in this format suggests that Favreau and his team considered it not as a marketing gimmick but as a genuine creative tool. The film's 132-minute running time is worth noting. This is a substantial film, longer than the average Star Wars feature, though not dramatically so, and it suggests that the story being told has genuine breadth. A film of this length has room to develop character, to allow relationships to breathe, to build toward its climaxes with proper preparation. It is not a film that has been artificially compressed or that will feel rushed. This is consistent with what Favreau has said about the story, that it is self contained, that it is designed to work for audiences who have not seen the series as well as those who have, and that it takes the emotional investment the audience has in these characters seriously enough to give that investment the time it needs. The supporting cast and returning characters deserve fuller consideration as well. Johnny Cohen as the Imperial Warlord Janu represents the persistent threat of the Empire's legacy in concrete human form. Imperial warlords are fascinating figures in the Star Wars mythology. Men and women who served a totalitarian regime who may have believed in what they served or may have simply been opportunists, and who now find themselves in a post Empire galaxy where the institutional support for their ambitions has crumbled but their own drive has not. Janu is described as the leader of a faction of Imperial remnants, suggesting an organized and ongoing threat rather than a lone wolf. A military commander who has maintained discipline and loyalty among his forces in the years since the Empire's fall, and who continues to pose a genuine danger to the New Republic's stability.